Did you know that in the 19th century, nearly 1 out of every 3 women in Britain worked in domestic service? Imagine a world where millions of young girls left their villages, not for school or freedom, but to scrub floors, polish silver, and live in the shadows of grand mansions. From dawn until long past midnight, their lives were ruled by the ringing of a bell. 14 hours of labor a day was the norm, and even a single mistake, like a broken teacup, could cost them their position, their shelter, and sometimes even their future. But here's the shocking part. Behind the glittering curtains of noble dining halls, the maids held secrets, secrets of whispered scandals, silent rebellions, and the invisible cost of keeping aristocratic life flawless. So what was it really like to be one of these women? What did they see, hear, and endure while the world above them dined in luxury? Stay with me, because every detail you're about to hear will reveal a side of history that polite society never wanted you to know. And if you love exploring the hidden daily lives of people from the past, give me a like, hit subscribe, and share this video. It's the best way to support me in bringing you more untold stories of history. Now, let's step through the servants' entrance and uncover the truth together. They say that in the 19th century, more than 1 million aristocratic households stretched across Britain and Europe. Imagine that number for a moment. 1 million families who lived in sprawling estates, grand manors, and glittering townhouses. To us today, they may look like scenes out of novels or costume dramas. But back then, these homes were living, breathing worlds of power, privilege, and strict order. When I picture it, I don't just see chandeliers and velvet curtains. I see the silent figures moving in the background, the maids, the butlers, the footmen, each one essential to keeping the illusion of perfection alive. It fascinates me how the wealth of a single noble family could employ dozens of servants. Yet their names were barely remembered. Honestly, sometimes I wonder, did those noble dinners even taste the same without the sweat of the kitchen maids? Or the careful hands of a housemaid scrubbing marble floors until they gleamed? What strikes me most is how invisible this world was. The aristocrats lived upstairs, in the light, while the servants lived downstairs, often in cramped quarters hidden from sight. 2 different worlds, under one roof, divided not by walls, but by silence and duty. And I can't help but think, if I had been alive back then, which side of the staircase would I belong to? This hidden universe of aristocratic households was the stage on which the maids' secret lives unfolded. Their routines, their struggles, and even their dreams were tied to these mansions. And to understand their story, we first need to step into their exhausting daily rhythm. So let's open the door to part 2. What did 14 hours of labor really look like for a 19th century maid? The day for a maid in the 19th century began long before the first rays of sunlight touched the grand windows of the estate. At 5 o'clock in the morning, while the household still slept, she would already be on her feet, tending to the fireplaces, carrying heavy buckets of coal, and preparing hot water so that her employers would never feel the chill of dawn. From there, the hours unfolded like a relentless chain. By breakfast time, she was polishing silver, scrubbing floors, and making sure every chair, curtain, and candle was perfectly placed. Meals had to be prepared and served with absolute precision. If the master wanted toast at exactly 7:30, it had better be waiting, warm and crisp, without a second's delay. The work did not pause in the afternoon. Laundry, mending clothes, dusting endless corridors, or waiting quietly in the corner of a parlor, her presence was constant, though barely acknowledged. What fascinates me is how invisible all this effort was. Guests admired the elegance of a ballroom but rarely thought of the weary girl who spent hours waxing the floor until it shone like glass. By evening, when the nobility dined and laughed under chandeliers, the maid was still running up and down the back stairs, carrying trays, clearing dishes, and making sure not a whisper of clatter disrupted the refined conversation upstairs. Midnight often struck before she returned to her tiny, shared room in the servants' quarters. 14 hours gone, and tomorrow promised exactly the same. To me, it feels almost unimaginable. 14 hours of constant duty, with no freedom to say no, no space for rest, and very little recognition. And yet, many of these young women endured it for years, because it was their only chance at shelter, food, and perhaps a small wage they could send back home. Their daily grind was more than just work. it was survival wrapped in silence. And within that silence existed another truth. Not all servants stood on equal ground. Some had the privilege of working closer to their masters, while others labored in the shadows of the kitchen or cellar. That leads us to part 3, the strict hierarchy of servant life, and how those invisible ranks shaped every hope and every hardship of a maid's future. Life as a maid was never equal, not even among the servants themselves. The world of domestic service in the 19th century was built on a rigid hierarchy. 5 clear ranks that decided everything: your workload, your living space, and even the way others looked at you. At the very bottom stood the maid of all work. She was usually the youngest or the poorest, expected to do whatever task was thrown at her. One moment scrubbing the scullery floor, the next running errands in the cold, and then rushing back to polish boots. Her life was a whirlwind of exhaustion, with little respect in return. I often think of her as the invisible engine of the entire household. Without her, the machine simply wouldn't run. Then came the kitchen maid, trapped in the heat and smoke of endless cooking. Her hands were red from scalding water, her back bent from lifting heavy pots. She worked under the cook, who could be as much a tyrant as a teacher. Still, for many, it was a step up, a place to prove themselves. Above them was the housemaid, responsible for the rooms upstairs. She dusted, polished, and made beds with perfect corners, moving silently so as not to disturb the masters. I imagine her pausing sometimes, gazing at a grand portrait on the wall, knowing she would never belong to that world of silk and jewels. Higher still was the lady's maid, a position many young servants dreamed of. She dressed the mistress, styled her hair, and even heard her secrets. Unlike the others, she might have a room of her own and better clothes. Yet, that privilege came with its own trap: complete dependence on the lady's favor. One wrong word, one small betrayal, and she could lose it all. At the top of this ladder stood the butler and housekeeper, the generals of the servant army. They ruled with authority, keeping strict order below stairs while ensuring perfect obedience above. Even the maids feared their gaze, for their word could shape a servant's entire fate. What fascinates me most is how this miniature society mirrored the very class divisions it served. Even among the poor, there were those considered higher and those left to toil in the dark corners. To me, it feels like a cruel irony that even when you had nothing, you could still be placed below someone else who also had nothing. This hierarchy defined every step of a maid's journey, but it didn't stop there. It even dictated what she could wear, how she walked, and when she spoke. Which brings us to part 4, the strict uniform of service, 2 sets of clothing that could bind an entire life. For most maids in the 19th century, their entire identity was reduced to just 2 sets of clothing. One was their working dress, a plain, dark gown made of sturdy fabric, paired with an apron that was almost always white. The other was their so-called Sunday best, a slightly finer version of the same, reserved for church or the rare day off. That was it. No bright colors, no personal style, no room for expression. I often imagine how suffocating that must have felt. To wake every morning and know that your uniform told the world exactly who you were, a servant. There was no hiding it. Even if you stepped outside the mansion, people in town could spot you instantly. You belonged to someone else's household, not to yourself. It wasn't just the clothing either, it was the rules that came with it. A maid's hair had to be neat, usually tied back under a cap. She had to walk quietly, keep her eyes lowered, and never speak unless spoken to. Imagine having to carry trays of crystal glasses, moving silently like a shadow, all while making sure your apron stayed spotless. One stain, one wrinkle, and it could be seen as a failure of character. What strikes me most is how these uniforms erased individuality. Each maid became interchangeable, a moving part of the household machine. And yet, behind every cap and apron was a young woman with her own dreams, fears, and desires, none of which the uniform allowed her to show. Personally, I can't help but think how crushing it would be to know that your entire life could be summed up in 2 plain dresses. But even within this rigid appearance, temptation and danger lurked. The walls of those mansions weren't only polished wood and velvet, they also hid whispers, risks, and scandals that could change a servant's life overnight. Which brings us to part 5, the 7 temptations and risks that haunted the secret lives of maids behind aristocratic doors. Behind the glitter of chandeliers and the polished shine of silverware, the life of a maid was never as simple as just working hard. Hidden in the shadows of aristocratic mansions were temptations and dangers, 7 of them. At least, that could change everything for a servant girl. The first was the constant risk of dismissal. Imagine working 14 hours a day, only to be sent away for a single broken plate or a harsh word overheard by the wrong person. For a maid, losing her job meant not just unemployment, but losing her home, her meals, and her entire safety net. The second was exhaustion itself. The long days wore down the body, and many maids suffered from illnesses that went untreated. A cough or a weak back could mean the end of their livelihood. The third temptation came in the form of forbidden relationships. A glance from a young footman, or worse, the attention of the master of the house, could lead to scandal. Some stories tell of maids who fell in love and dreamed of escape, while others speak of girls dismissed in disgrace after being taken advantage of. Personally, I find this the most heartbreaking, because in a world where they had so little power, even love could become dangerous. The fourth risk was gossip. Servants lived so close to their employers that they often heard secrets never meant for their ears. To whisper them could mean punishment. To keep them meant carrying a heavy burden in silence. The fifth was theft, sometimes real, sometimes only suspected. Even if a trinket went missing, a maid could be blamed, whether guilty or not. The sixth temptation was escape. Many maids dreamed of leaving for the city, starting anew, or even traveling abroad, but stepping outside the mansion without permission could brand them untrustworthy forever. And finally, the seventh danger was invisibility. After years of service, many maids simply faded from history, their names forgotten. To me, this may be the cruelest fate of all, to live, labor, and sacrifice, and yet leave no trace behind. What strikes me is how fragile their lives were. One mistake, one rumor, one unlucky glance could undo years of effort. And yet, they carried on, because behind the risk lay the only chance they had for survival. But their story doesn't end in despair. Out of this hidden world of toil and silence grew something unexpected. A legacy that would spark movements for change. Which leads us to part 6, 200 years later, how the sweat of maids became a symbol of social justice and equality. 200 years may feel like an eternity, but the echoes of those maids' footsteps still reach us today. The lives they endured, of endless hours, rigid rules, and silent sacrifice, did not simply vanish when the great houses faded. Instead, they became part of a larger story, the fight for fair work, dignity, and equality. Out of the kitchens and sculleries of the 19th century came the first whispers of labor rights. Servants who once bowed their heads helped inspire future generations to demand shorter working hours, fair wages, and the recognition that every worker deserved rest and respect. It amazes me to think that the struggles of one overlooked maid polishing silver in a candlelit room could connect, across time, to the victories of modern workers who now have weekends, contracts, and protection under the law. We also see their legacy in the rise of women's voices. For countless maids, service was the only path available, but it planted seeds of resilience. Some later became activists, writers, or simply mothers who taught their daughters to expect something more. When I look at movements for women's suffrage or labor reform, I can't help but imagine the invisible hands of maids behind them, pushing quietly but firmly against the weight of history. Even in culture, their memory lingers, from novels like Jane Eyre to modern series like Downton Abbey and Bridgerton. The figure of the maid is never far away, a reminder of the untold stories behind aristocratic splendor. And personally, I feel that's the real lesson. History is not only written by kings and queens, but also by the nameless women who scrubbed their floors. So, what can we take from this today? To me, it's simple. We are all shaped by the invisible labor of others, the ones who cook our meals, clean our streets, care for our families. Remembering the maids of the 19th century is not just about the past, it's about honoring dignity in every form of work, here and now. And that brings our journey to a close. But before we end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were a maid 200 years ago, do you think you would have endured the silence, or tried to break free? Tell me in the comments below. And if you enjoy discovering these hidden pieces of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Every bit of support helps me bring more forgotten voices back to life.